Today's video is all about learning to handstand for the complete beginner or somebody who's got very little exposure. Hope my great drawings don't offend your eyes too much. I'm not the best artist and I had to use Ollie's little whiteboard to get this done. This is sort of the general spiel that I like to give at workshops I run and to any beginners that are trying to learn to handstand. So while some people do like to argue semantics about hand balancing with physics and that sort of thing, I think the information on here is a good general sort of base to just get you understanding what actually creates balance. It is a core strength, I'll just tell you now. So you'll see here, this is my first little drawing. Head, arms, legs, etc. Man doing a handstand. The biggest thing to note here, center of mass is somewhere around here on the body, probably not on that stick figure, but in a real human. This is the basic support. I've expanded this here, this little drawing here, the two hands, all that space there is our basic support, and your center of mass can be anywhere in this basic support and you are in a two-arm handstand. Generally, it's going to sit somewhere in the middle if you look at the shape of the basic support, given that it's quite long that way but short this way. It's going to be quite easy to keep it relatively in the middle due to the size of the basic support that way, but because of the oval being quite narrow this way, our center of mass is going to tend to oscillate backwards and forwards a little bit between overbalance and underbalance. You'll see where our fingers are, my tiny little bare hands. As our center of mass travels that way, it falls to our fingers to be able to dig into the ground and correct us. As we fall back this way, we don't have fingers behind our hands, thankfully, because that look weird. But because we don't have them, our shoulders and our elbows tend to do the balancing. And you've got various other mechanisms throughout the body for correcting either of those two things as well. Arching, piking, whatever. But generally speaking, they're your two main corrections that you're going to do. Just for the purpose of what I've got written here, when your center of mass travels sideways, that's due to either flagging or shifting. So either moving across to one shoulder more than the other, which is shifting, or if you're flagging, that tends to be moving initially in straddle, but you can do it tucked or in straight as well with your legs, but using your hips to shift side to side. You do have rotation as well, but given the kind of shape of that basic support, that long oval, you're going to tend to get very little on two arms, and that's more going to be a problem for a one arm. Looking at this, you'll see center of mass, the higher that is off your basic support, the harder it's going to be for your fingers to save the overbalance, and the longer the lever it is for your shoulders to save underbalance. So while a really nice tall straight handstand looks very pretty and aesthetic and all of that, and it is technically slightly more efficient in terms of more of your weight being within your basic support, we'll talk about that later. The higher you push, the longer you make that lever, and while prettier, you tend to become more fragile too. So it's important for beginners to know that a lot of the time in the beginning, a little bit of banana or low shoulders will actually keep your center of mass a touch lower and make corrections a little bit easier. Very rare for a complete newbie to find a perfectly straight handstand the most comfortable and easy to hold. I've sort of expanded on this here a little bit with this great drawing. So basic support, our center of mass number one, so when we're in our straight handstand, our center of mass exists up here. As we change our shapes, either by straddling our legs, by tucking our legs, or by piking our legs, you're going to bring your center of mass down. So technically a little bit less work for your hands and shoulders for the over and under balance. However, as you do those things, more of your body weight starts to exist outside of your basic support. Our hand is relatively sort of short, so as I do a tuck, my bum's going this way, my legs are going this way, and it's more often than not going to displace more weight to the underbalanced side. So it's going to take a lot more for our shoulders to stay really rigid. So the only exception to this is if you straddle. So when you straddle, a lot of your weight's actually going up the side, and given we've got a long basic support side to side, it's quite easy to manage. So it kind of drops your center of mass with very little trade-off unless you start aggressively sort of straddling. So somebody that has very bad mobility, they'll straddle and they might get to here, but then they have to start actually piking. So that starts bringing the legs into underbalance more. If you've got a really good middle split, you can basically straddle for free with very little piking and very little trade-off. But yeah, where I was going with that, the trade-off is your shoulders start to get loaded heavier and it moves you more towards a bit of that underbalance. So knowing this, that's all we really need to know on how to hold a two arm. You'll notice here that none of this touches on core strength, core tension, anything like that. The big reason I don't like to focus on it, while it does make a slight difference in skills that you're moving through to have core tension. If you think about our pelvis having four strings sort of, so on one side we've got our abs, on the bottom side we've got our hip flexors, on the other side glutes and hamstrings, on the top side our lower back, and they all sort of work together to tilt our pelvis around. What you're looking for is a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt, which can either be a tensing of the abs or a tucking under with the glutes. Two options there. One of them, tensing your abs, tends to inhibit your breathing a little bit and makes shoulder flexion a little bit tougher. So given we want to be relatively tall and pulling into shoulder flexion, I think it's generally not good to be squeezing our abs. Just a little bit of possibly sucking in for a bit of tension, but even then, just squeezing your butt in and under a little bit tends to do all that you need. A raw beginner will actually find it quite hard to turn the lower back off, and you'll find when you start introducing tucks, because the lower back's quite tight, you'll get a bit of a burning sensation because that's arching to try and keep rigidity, and then as you pull your knees down, it pulls against it and it pulls the pelvis under a little bit, and you'll get a bit of a burning sensation. So if you do try tucks for the first time, you get a bit of burning. It doesn't really matter, you're not going to injure yourself. You just have to learn how to relax your lower back a little bit. All you do sort of need through the core is a bit of awareness on how not to go completely loose. Until you start doing more sort of Mexican movements and a little bit of pressing, you don't use your abs a whole lot. And even then, you shouldn't be using your abs too much to press. It's a bit more through the hips. So, learning to two arm, we need to do movements or train movements that support shoulders, developing shoulders that support and balance. So shoulders that can take our body weight and hold a position here, 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 wherever your sort of shoulders naturally sit in a decent overhead position. They need to be able to support that for a decent period of time. Generally a good goal for beginners is to be able to do 1 minute and then rounds of a minute with not too much rest. Next up is, in priorities, is fingers and hands that can correct overbalance. So if our shoulders are able to support us and balance a little bit when we're going to underbalance, then fingers that balance the other way are going to do the other side of this equation that keep us balanced. And then the body awareness, just to make whatever leftover corrections that you need to do that your hands and shoulders and elbows aren't doing, and to keep relatively sort of still or rigid through the middle body so that you're not wasting your energy. What I sort of try and explain to people, if you had a percentage assigned to how much your body is balancing with, a beginner might be 40% shoulders, 40% hands, and then 20% everything else. Spit on the piss. As you get better on two arms, you'll start to find that this number goes up and you start doing 80% of the balancing through your hands, and you keep the rest of your body quite still. This will go down first, and then this will go down second. Once you become very proficient, you'll actually start to see this will go down a little bit again, and this will go up a bit again. As your center of mass moves back on your hand, which it naturally will, because our forearm muscles are smaller and weaker than the rest of the muscles we're trying to use to balance, as you become efficient, you'll actually learn to balance back on the palm a little bit more, and you'll do less hand balancing on two arms. This tends to happen once you're doing more advanced sort of movements, learning to one arm, that sort of thing. But sometimes it can happen sooner. But for the purpose of this, we are trying to learn to make probably up to 90% of our corrections through our hands. So you want to have like 90%, 5 to 10, and then whatever is left over for everything else. You don't want to be doing too much balancing through the rest of the body. Alright, so that's all that. I don't think there's anything else that I really need to cover, except I'll talk about this quickly. This is just kind of a warning. It's not so much that you need to pay attention to it to learn to balance. I definitely didn't. However, when you are balancing, you've got three sort of positions that your palm and fingers could be in. This is called a cup. So your hand sits like this. You've got 2 points of contact. If you look at when you've got those 2 points of contact, when you bend your fingers from that position, it actually pushes kind of 45 degrees backwards and down. The problem with this is, as you're tipping over, that means the energy that's pushing back rather than down is actually not helping you. It's not doing anything to save you. So if you start developing really long holds, which I did with that kind of technique, you can run into the problem of getting sore on the attachment sort of around here, where all the flexors come in, because you're overusing them a lot. A lot of the energy is wasted. They're expending twice as much essentially. If you think 45 degrees, half is going down, half is going backwards. So you're wasting a lot of energy when you're cupping your hands. There are plenty that have learnt to one arm, pretty advanced sort of balancing with that technique, so it's not a guaranteed problem. However, I did run into problems. I had a lot of elbow pain and tendonitis, and it wasn't until I fixed that that I overcame it. The two options to fix that are going to 3 points of contact, so it's hard to do. From the cup, you sort of go to that instead, so you've got contact, contact, contact. That pushes down, maybe a small percentage goes backwards, but you're wasting much less energy. So that tends to be the preferred. There is also just your entire hand pressing flat into the ground, which I think is something that's good for people to muck around with a little bit in their warm-ups once they're capable of balancing with either of these techniques. It does force you to use a lot more wrist extension and finger extension, and just use the hands a bit differently, plus it's a really big base of support, so it's something to mess around with a little bit. But same thing, most of your force is going straight down. The problem is you don't want to learn to balance like that because it's very fatiguing to hold the hand flat and open. So for me, I still find that quite tough to go past 30 seconds without my first knuckle starting to lift up and cup a little bit, because it's been such a long sort of journey for me to kind of overcome my tendency to do that. I couldn't even do a front support with my hands flat when I first started. So depending on where you're at, you may find that tough. Anywho, let's move on to the fun stuff.